So we're talking about Auguste Comte. He was born in Montpellier, and there's a little biography there. So he was the founder of the Positivist school, Positivist. He was a big fan of, yes. Oh, yeah. He was a big, Auguste Comte belongs to the Positivist school. He was sort of the French version of Immanuel Kant. His premises are as follows: metaphysics as a science of first causes is impossible, so that's Kant. Research of the absolute is a dream because, he says, the absolute is inaccessible to the human mind, not only in philosophy, but in everything. So he rejects the German transcendentalism. To observe, analyze, and classify particular facts, and to determine by induction the laws which govern the existence of sensible phenomena, taking care to exclude all metaphysical notions, is the only way in which to arrive at a knowledge of reality. So essentially, this is the method of experimental science. He's saying that experimental science performs experiments, and from patterns that reveal themselves in the experiments, they make general laws, or first hypotheses and then general laws. That is legitimate for experimental science, but metaphysics is going the precise opposite way, and that is it's going from essences down, so it's deductive. See, the other way is inductive. Induction is to, look at 10 birds and they all have 2 feet. Well, that must be a property of birds to have 2 feet. That's induction, and it's legitimate as long as you have a sufficient number of examples. If you just happen to look at 2 different birds and they have 2 feet, you cannot make a general principle that all birds have 2 feet. In fact, they do. But you could not, that's an insufficient induction. Now, you should have covered that in logic. Or you will. So he's saying that philosophy has to be done in the same way. So true philosophy rejects all theological being and all metaphysical reality. So he's just applying what we would call the experimental scientific method to philosophy, which is ridiculous. 3, since for positive philosophy the absolute and first causes are completely unknown and inaccessible to reason, positivism is neither theist nor pantheist nor atheistic, and theologically considered is neither immanent nor transcendent. So it's totally non-religious. See, there's nothing you can know about God. All theological and all metaphysical doctrine are stripped of objective value in the eyes of positive philosophy. So, what's left? What's left? There is no other truth, no other reality than the truth and reality which is certified by positive science. So don't forget, the 19th century is drunk with pride over its scientific advances. I mean, when you consider, say 1800 to 1850, there were quite a few scientific advances. And that was unheard of up to about 1800. I mean, there was some science going on in the 18th century. But the change of people's lives from 1800 to 1850 was extraordinary from the point of view of scientific research and inventions. It was even more extraordinary from 1850 to 1900, and far more extraordinary from 1900 to 1950. So, here you had the rise of the steam engines and steamboats, and you had railroads in England, 1830s. It was considered that if you went more than 20 miles an hour, that you would go insane. That was commonly held during the 1830s, 1840s, that if you exceeded 20 miles an hour, you would go insane. Yes. So, and I remember, and I think it was the latter part of the 19th century, that they got trains to go 60 miles an hour, which was a mile a minute. And that was just considered like the speed of sound, that something could go a mile a minute. So, so anyway, the 19th century was drunk with this idea of advancing in science. All the use of steel, the Eiffel Tower, and various other the Crystal Palace, which burned down in England, but that was all steel and iron, and that was a big deal too. That you were building buildings with steel and iron. A lot of other advances. So. He's the high priest of experimental science, and he's going to turn philosophy into an experimental science. That's essentially it. Comte also has what he calls a constructive side to his philosophy, which he calls three states. According to Comte, the progressive development of humanity over space and time is accomplished according to three fundamental evolutionary stages, which represent the three states of the human mind. When the mind fixes its attention and its activity in the world and its appearances, it seeks the origin of these things in supernatural beings, in invisible forces. He calls this the theological stage of science. The second stage is the metaphysical, in which man explains the world and its phenomena by metaphysical hypotheses, by a priori conceptions, and by abstract ideas. All right? So there's Kant. Thus, the metaphysical hypothesis succeeds to the theological fiction. The third stage is positive science, in which the world and its phenomena are analyzed in themselves and are explained by their immediate and homogeneous causes. The last is the only true science. Although Comte anathematizes religion, he nevertheless calls for a religion of humanity, which he proposes to institute and organize. For him, there is one great being of which individuals are merely the organs. How he knows that? Does he have an experiment to show that? Other adherents to this system are Littré, who was a Freemason, who did a famous dictionary in French, the Littré dictionary. Stuart Mill, who was awful, and Herbert Spencer, who was yet worse. Okay, both British. Critique of positivism. Positivism is merely the logical conclusion of the Kantian agnosticism, in the same way that pantheistic evolutionism of Hegel is the logical conclusion of Kant's idealism. So you see, Kant is giving it's like a twofold river coming out of Kant, and you can see one side or the other. It's a little bit like Archbishop Lefebvre, in the sense it's a twofold doctrine of Archbishop Lefebvre. You can go either way on it, and that's why you have really two camps of the traditional movement, because he went back and forth on a lot of things. So not to compare him to any of these people, but I'm just saying that that's the only similarity, that in Kant you find two how would you say, principles that will be developed on one side or the other in the 19th century. So positivism is fundamentally not different from 17th century English empiricism. All right. Now we get into the real. If you think it's been bad now, up to now, we're really going to get into it. So, we're on we did Hegel. We finished positivism, and now we're on pantheism, page 37. All right. Pantheism in general we have already examined Hegel's pantheism, which sees the prime and fundamental reality as an idea, which is in constant process. So that is Hegel. Everything is the idea, is identified with the idea. And as the Thomists says, some Thomists say, well, who has the idea? That's one critique of Hegel. Who has the idea? Secondly, idea by its very nature is an image. So of what is it an image? So that's the second withering critique of Hegel. But anyway, everything is the idea, and it's in constant process. It's, you see, it's like a boiling pot. It's always moving and never the same, and it never stays the same. So it's always becoming. It is becoming. Being is meaningless to him. Everything is becoming. See? And of which material things are merely moments or manifestations. So you're just a manifestation of the idea. We have also examined Spinoza's pantheism, confusing the term substance with something that exists by itself and on its own, and therefore it's God. That was his problem. Everything's God because it's a substance. You go back and look at your notes. Here we will examine the diverse forms of 19th century pantheism in the wake of Hegel. So the first one is Krause. And you'll see that there is a heavy dominance of Germans in pantheism. Carl Christian Friedrich Krause. His dates are 1781 to 1832. Anybody know something that famous that happened in the year 1781? Battle of Yorktown. All right, so that's something you can put in your pocket. The 1832, I can't think of anything of it, and I think that was the death of Leo XII, but I can't remember. A German philosopher was born in Eisenberg, which means Iron Mountain. It doesn't sound quite as exotic when you say Iron Mountain, but Eisenberg. Educated first at Eisenberg, then he proceeded to Jena, which it was like a pit of error. Okay, so you know it's just where you go to wallow in the pit of error. All right, where he studied philosophy under Hegel and Fichte. Imagine, and became a Privatdozent. That means a private teacher, like a tutor, that was not hired by the university, but permitted to teach. In 1802. In the same year, with characteristic imprudence, he married a wife without a dowry. Now you're seeing these underlines. All of this biographical information I lifted from something called the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy or something like that. So I don't have these things memorized. Okay. 2 years later, lack of pupils compelled him to move to Rudolstadt, and later to Dresden, which is the capital of Saxony, where he gave lessons in music. In 1805, his ideal of a universal world society, notice that. Oh yes, it was in all of them. And led him to join the Freemasons, whose principles seemed to tend in the direction he desired. Okay. He published 2 books on Freemasonry, Die drei ältesten Kunsturkunden der Freimaurer Bruderschaft, for those of you who know German, the 3 oldest craft documents of the Masonic Brotherhood, and Höhere Vergeistigung der echt überlieferten Grundsymbole der Freimaurerei in 12 Logenvorträgen. All right, for those of you who appreciate German, the higher spiritualization of the truly traditional basic symbols of Freemasonry in 12 lodge lectures. All right? But opinions drew upon him the opposition of the Masons. The Masons didn't like what he said. Imagine what he said. He lived for a time in Berlin and became a Privatdozent. See, Dozent, but was unable to obtain a professorship. He therefore proceeded to Göttingen and afterwards to Munich, where he died of apoplexy, which simply means a stroke. It's an old word for a stroke, apoplexy. A lot of people died of apoplexy before they had blood pressure pills. So there's no reason to underline that. That's just... At the very moment when the influence of Franz von Bade had at last obtained a position for him. So he died before he could become anything significant. So that's Krause. He's not very significant. Krause professes psychological pantheism. Our ego, that is, our consciousness, is identified with the universal consciousness. Hence, the principle of all knowledge must be drawn from our ego. So it's like one huge computer. You see, there's a universal consciousness, and we're hooked up to that. And from it, all knowledge proceeds. Eternal being, or God, is manifested in us and through us. There's your modernism. And other external beings are either phantasms or modifications by which infinite being is made known to us. Krause wanted to retain the existence of a personal God. That's a nice thing. The world is in some way a part of God. God and the world are in one essence, in such a way, however, that God is the whole essence and the world is not the whole essence. God is the one essence, infinite and total, outside of which there is nothing. He is the indeterminate and infinite being. Notice that. Indeterminate and infinite. Indeterminate, that means he has no nature. All being, and consequently he is everything which is and is immanent in all things. This is standard fare pantheism. I mean, this is, they all say the same stuff, just a little differently. The essence of God, considered as one essence, total and infinite, contains in itself all finite beings, not only as the cause contains the effect, but as the whole contains the part. The life of God is in a perpetual becoming. Because man is contained essentially in the life of God, it follows that for man to live is to realize the divine essence by transforming into act what is only possible and virtual in God. So he sort of makes God expand and become more perfect. Human liberty, which is only a development and a realization of the essence and of the life of God, is produced eternally in God and by God. It is necessary to conclude from this that even the bad use of liberty is produced in God and by God. So murder and rape and well, it comes from God. Krause also has a curious mystical aspect to his philosophy, whereby individual human beings constitute only partial humanities, which I would believe about some, retaining at the same time a consciousness of their union with other humanities. Thus there is an all humanity of which each individual life is a mere phase. His disciples concluded that the soul is not immortal in the proper sense of the term, and negated eternal life as the reward for virtue in this life. Krause even believed in a reincarnation of souls in other worlds with other humanities. This theory is closely related to Spiritism and Theosophy. Critique of Krause. It is obvious that the consciousness is not the principle and source of all cognition. Furthermore, if God is one essence with the world, he loses his personal esse and is not pure act. Therefore, all of the absurdities of general pantheism occur or recur. So it's just another brand of pantheism. He's not a big player in 19th century philosophy, but Schopenhauer is. That's the next one, 1788 to 1860. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Stutthof. And where is, you can pronounce the Polish for us? Stutthof. Okay. Poland, near Danzig, which is the northern coast on the Baltic, famous in World War II. He was the son of Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer and Johanna Schopenhauer, a middle-class mercantile family of Dutch heritage, although they had strong feelings against any kind of nationalism. Indeed, the name Arthur was selected by his father especially because it was the same in English, German, and French. Yes. So they're weird. Okay, these are sick, weird people to begin with. The parents are, odd. And you see, that was 1788. That was Prussia. It was Prussian Poland. So to be anti-nationalist in Prussia was, was to be basically a leftist. Unless you were Polish, because the Polish wanted their own country, obviously. But people from Holland, of course, Holland. We don't have to speak about Holland. So I hope we never get a Dutch seminarian. Well, won't be able to say anything. But they'll have to understand that, their country was just attracted all of those people. It was the leftist place in Europe. So his parents were both from the city, and Johanna was an author as well. So there's some intellectual activity going on here. After the city was annexed by Prussia during the second partition of Poland in 1793, the Schopenhauer family moved to Hamburg. All right, that's northern Germany. In 1805, Schopenhauer's father died, possibly by suicide, and Johanna moved to Weimar, also famous for a certain regime. All right. Because of a promise to pursue a business career, Schopenhauer remained in Hamburg. His disgust of this career, however, drove him away to join his mother in Weimar after only a year. He never got along with his mother when the writer Goethe, who was originally an Illuminist but then quit the Illuminati, but a Freemason, Goethe, who was a friend of Johanna Schopenhauer, told her that he thought her son was destined for great things. Johanna objected. She had never heard that there could be two geniuses in a single family. So Schopenhauer studied at the University of Göttingen and was awarded a PhD from the University of Jena. All right, so in 1820, Jena must just have been awful. In 1820, Schopenhauer became a lecturer at the University of Berlin, and it was there that his opposition to Hegel, Georg, whatever his name is, I forget his name, Hegel began. He attended lectures by the prominent post-Kantian philosopher Fichte and the theologian Schleiermacher, who was the founder of liberal Protestantism and a forerunner of modernism. Everything was the religious experience, Schleiermacher. modernism happened long in Protestantism, long before it happened in Catholicism. It was the product of Illuminism of the 18th century. And the Protestants embraced that much more than the Catholics did. So it happened, but then by the 1880s, it started to creep into Catholic sacred scripture. So, but Schleiermacher was a scripture scholar, a very important figure in the history of all of this, Schleiermacher. Although Schopenhauer would start to react to the extreme idealism of Fichte. Schopenhauer daringly scheduled his own lectures at exactly the same time as his nemesis Hegel. Hegel, however, was extremely popular. Why? I don't know. Because his philosophy is impossible to understand. But he was extremely popular in his lectures, in the hope of attracting students to come to his own lectures instead of Hegel's. You see? However, no students turned up to Schopenhauer's course of lectures, and subsequently he left, never to teach in a university again. How do you like his hair? Isn't his hair a hoot? You know, looks like he just touched an electrical cord or something. So Schopenhauer's health deteriorated during the year of 1860. He died of natural causes on September 21st of the same year at the age of 72. Schopenhauer called himself a Kantian and despised Hegel. He formulated a pessimistic philosophy that gained importance and support after the failure of the German and Austrian revolutions of 1848. See, the 1848, there was a Europe-wide revolution planned by Freemasons and leftists to overturn the monarchies and to make republics out of all of those places, you know, leftist republics. And they, although they made some headway, you might say, in Austria and in Germany, they did not succeed. They continue to be monarchies, but they caved in to certain demands of the revolutionaries in 1848, and so that's when, you know, there was the Garibaldi invaded Rome in 1848. So there was revolution in Italy. There was a lot of revolution in France. That's the collapse of the government of Louis Philippe, and the beginning, well, sort of. The beginning, we had terrible trouble in Paris, and that's the person that would end up ruling France would be Napoleon III, who was started out as the big Democrat, that I'm for a republic, and then ended up the emperor. About 2 years later, ended up the emperor of France. So anyway. So 1848 was a bad year in Europe. So Arthur Schopenhauer was influenced by Fichte's idealism, declaring that there is no object without subject. See, so nothing exists unless there is a subject, a knowing subject. In other words, the intellect is prime over the object. He thus denied the objective reality of things outside the mind. So a big rock doesn't exist outside the mind. So when it comes down and hits your head, it doesn't exist outside the mind. Okay? So you know that. He said that the essence of man and the essence of the universe is a will. He professed the system of pantheism, that is, of a unique, perverse, and fatal will. So there is an evil will that operates the whole universe. He's a very famous figure, Schopenhauer. A lot of that is in Hitlerism. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche will contribute to Nazism a great deal. Will, therefore, determines our knowledge and constitutes reality. So that means what you want to be true is. I told you what Goebbels said when the Allies had crossed the Rhine, crossed into Germany, got into the Rhineland. He said, we are going to win because we have to win. There is a will that Nazi Germany prevail. And that will must happen. That ran very, very strong in Hitler's ideas. Very strong. For him, will means not only rational choice, but also blind instinct, the will to live. He says that there is an all-permeating, all-producing will as a natural force in the world. It manifests itself in all of the instinctive, mechanical, and vital movements of natural beings. So instead of idea, it's will. See, there's this big will with a capital W. Schopenhauer was a pessimist, to say the least. Man makes misery for himself by the instinctive pursuit of the will to live. So going to the supermarket and shopping is, making life miserable for everybody else. Because you have a will to live, because you get food in order to live. Well, he doesn't say that, but that would be true. I mean, your will to live makes other people miserable? I mean, these people are sick. Critique of Schopenhauer. Hugon calls Schopenhauer's philosophy insanity and says that it would be more properly called pan-Satanism than pantheism. Noteworthy followers of Schopenhauer are Edvard von Hartmann, who attempted to reconcile Schopenhauer and Hegel, imaginez-vous, and Richard Wagner, the famous composer, and Friedrich Nietzsche. So you see that in Wagner's that dark, the dark orchestra and all. You have to listen to Wagner a little bit. I mean, some of it is, sounds, but you can hear that it's dark. It's the only way you could put it, and all of those themes, like the ring cycle where Brunhilde, at the end, Brunhilde on a horse, and they got the horse right on the stage, charges into Valhalla, which is on fire. That's the end of the ring cycle. That means it's the end of 3 separate operas, 4 hours apiece. And as I said of Wagner, mostly screaming. Okay, there is an occasional break where you hear some really nice music, and it lasts for about 10 minutes. And then the screaming starts again. It's true, just, you can watch one of them. But some people love Wagner. But he wrote some pretty nice music. A lot of use of trombones, tubas, the dark brass. And, but Hitler loved Wagner. That's all you could listen to practically on the German radio in Nazi Germany was Wagner. And you couldn't listen to Schubert because he had Jewish blood in him. You couldn't listen to Mendelssohn, obviously. He was Felix Mendelssohn. He was a Jew who converted to Protestantism. You couldn't listen to him. Various others were banned. So Wagner was it. Wagner was very, very anti-Jewish. The Parsifal is a big anti-Jewish opera. It's never performed. Parsifal. Yeah. So he was the hero. He would go every year to a German city where they would put on the Wagner. It was a Wagnerian festival every year, and Wagner's granddaughter was there to greet him. There's pictures of that. So anyway, but that you can see the linkage there. Nietzsche too. We'll see Nietzsche shortly. We're going to go into Heartman now. Edvard von Hartmann was a German philosopher. How do you like that beard? Born at Berlin, February 23rd, 1842, and died at the same place on June 5th, 1906. He was educated at the School of Artillery in Berlin and held a commission when he was compelled to retire on account of serious knee trouble. He took his degree at Rostock in 1867, returned to Berlin, and retired to Lichterfelde, 5 miles southwest of Berlin, in 1885, doing most of his work in bed while suffering great pain. After developing the thought for 22 years, he began in 1864 to prepare his main philosophical work, Philosophie des Unbewussten, that is, the philosophy of the unconscious. Next in rank was das sittliche Bewusstsein, the meaningful or consciousness, appearing first as a Phänomenologie des sittlichen Bewusstseins, the phenomenology of moral consciousness. And next to that was the Religionsphilosophie, religious philosophy, and das religiöse Bewusstsein der Menschheit in die Religion des Geistes. All right, so the religious consciousness of mankind and the religion of the spirit, 1882. He invented the system of unconscious being. The principle of things is the identity of the will and cognition, which is impregnated by representation. Representation, however, must lack all consciousness, since this is imperfection and involves failure, for which reason the principle of things is unconscious. The world is only an appearance of this volition. All things are one. Man is constituted by the unconscious and has no other immortality except that which he obtains as a phenomenon or manifestation of the divine substance, owing to his union with the unconscious. So instead of an idea, you have the unconscious, like somebody in a coma. The unconscious evolves in a triple phase, in paganism, in Christianity, and in modern times, and these three things are three levels of illusion. Critique of Hartmann. This theory is insanity, and is very injurious to the true and glorious God, who, containing in himself all perfections actu, cannot lack consciousness, nor can he develop into representations and appearances. Hartmann is not a big figure. He comes up occasionally, but he's not a big figure. Now, next, Nietzsche. Big figure. Look at that mustache. Friedrich Nietzsche found life hateful and fled from human company. So he's a nice guy. He was far more pessimist than Schopenhauer. What is surprising is that he hated his native Germany, particularly German nationalism. He lived in that time. He ended his life in insanity, so he went crazy. Despite his oddity, and you can see it in the eyes, despite his oddity and insanity, Nietzsche has had an enormous influence upon the world. The English playwright George Bernard Shaw, who was a socialist, considered Nietzsche to be his only master. No single philosopher had more influence upon Adolf Hitler than Friedrich Nietzsche. Yes?
Your Excellency, is the manner of his insanity, when people attribute to him, is that true? He had syphilis?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, with a philosophy like that, what's to hold you back? Nietzsche's most famous work is Also sprach Zarathustra, all right, which means thus spoke Zarathustra. All right. Richard Strauss wrote now don't confuse him with the Waltz King, Johann Strauss Jr. Richard Strauss, which means ostrich, was a composer late 19th century, and he wrote the music, and it's famous because the movie used it. Also sprach Zarathustra, I have to say it right. So, Zarathustra is another name for Zoroaster, the ancient Persian god. Nietzsche considers Zarathustra the creator of that most portentous error, morality, and thinks that the same God should recognize his mistake. So he should apologize. Nietzsche rejects human responsibility, guilt, and sin. You know, that's nice. Ethical codes are only for common people. That was typical of Hitler. That the upper echelon of humanity doesn't have bourgeois moral codes. And so the idea of invasion and aggressive warfare, etc., respecting treaties, that's for bourgeois, that's for little people. They do that. That's in Hitler's writings and his comments. The Superman does as he, Supermen are not subject to morality. So that was part of the Nazi culture too, is that the Germans are the Supermen and everyone else was Untermenschen, especially the Poles and all of the Slavic peoples to the east. They were all Untermenschen. That means under peoples, like second-rate people. That's how they referred to them. And they thought they could march right through because they could just crush the Untermenschen right in front of them. No, it's true. This is what they thought. That's why, he invaded Russia. It was an insanity. And he basically dragged Poland into the war. The incident was the incident which sparked the war was done by Germans dressed up as Polish soldiers. And there was an incident, some firing, and somebody died or something like that. And it was German soldiers dressed up as Polish who did it, because he wanted a war with Poland. It was part of his expansion of Germany. I forget the term he used, but that the Germans had the right to expand into ultimately Russia and take all of Russia. Yes. Yes, Lebensraum, yes. Lebensraum. Also Lebensraum, that means love. But the Lebensraum, that the Germany was a super race, and they had the right to overrun all of the Untermenschen east of them. That was the idea. Yes. No, there's no name for it. It's just that he was picking for a war with Poland. It was all in his plan. And he did not think that either England or France would declare war as a result of it. Do I need to be there? Oh, okay. He did not think that England or France would, because he said, I saw them at Munich. That was in spring of of 1938, I believe. I saw them in Munich, and I realized that they had no courage. He said it differently, but that they were basically feckless and without any guts. They won't do anything. Well, they did something. So he wasn't really counting on a Western war. He thought he could knock off Poland, but Poland gave him a hard time. Much more than he thought. 40,000 German soldiers lost their lives in the Polish War, which is a lot. So, anyway. For Nietzsche, there are two moralities, master morality and slave morality. This is all Nazi theory. The ordinary man who is bereft of genius must obey moral codes and commandments, but the higher man, the master, is not bound by such things. He makes his own values. These supermen are not subject to the judgments of lesser men. Nietzsche was very anti-democratic. See, so that also was Hitleresque. Hitler had, despised democracies and constantly criticized. So he was anti-democratic. He also believes that there are master races and master nations. They too are above morality. A few strong men are worth all the rest of the world. They are the world, the only world that deserves to be reckoned with. The weak and the unworthy should learn self-sacrifice and leave the practice of self-assertion to the Superman. This is from the Introduction to Zarathustra. This is like the Nazi playbook. It's true. It's very much. He applied the theory of evolution to his Superman. Just as man evolved from lower species, so the Superman evolves from lower men. Nietzsche was for the elimination of the weak and parasitic. That's exactly what the Nazis did. They would put to death anybody that had Down syndrome or other problems, insane people, people with just disorders and problems, and retarded people. And they were heavily criticized by the Bishop von Galen, and they stopped because of his intervention, but Goebbels made some comment like, wait until the end of the war. This was just before the war was started. I think it was 1938. In other words, wait until we get through. They had the whole war planned. Anyway. So, but they would get rid of those people. At least they didn't do it publicly. He says that there is forever a class of people who devitalize the strong because they are in need of constant care and assistance. These people ought to be left to die. They would just kill them, that's all. The weak and the unsuccessful shall perish, and we will even help them perish. This is our love of mankind. Yes?
This extermination before the war, it wasn't public, but after the war, they wanted it to be a public thing?
No, well, yeah, in other words, that, okay, the Catholic Church is strong enough to stop us now, but wait until after we're, totally victorious, and we'll just deal with that. That was the idea. Nietzsche had a detestation for Christ, just as Hitler did. He called him that immodest one, that the singular saint and advocate of petty people who testified, I am the truth. Thou, O Zarathustra, passed by him and said, nay, nay, 3 times nay. Of Christians, he says, oh, that someone would save them from their Savior. Remember that Hitler said he would rather see pigs eat from a trough than Catholics receive Holy Communion. Even though he was raised a Catholic. Nietzsche wrote, the greatest event of recent times, that God is dead, that belief in the Christian God has become unworthy of belief, already begins to cast its first shadows over Europe. At last the horizon lies free before us, even granted that it is not bright. At least the sea, our sea, lies open before us. Perhaps there has never been so open a sea. What he is saying is that the end of belief in the Christian God paves the way for a new civilization which will have the life of this world as its goal. Bergoglio. He prophesied rightly that the death of God will inevitably be followed sooner or later by the rejection of absolute values and the idea of an objective and universal moral law. Nietzsche is a nihilist, that is, someone who believes that in no values and no morality and no purpose for existence. He also predicted major wars, ideological wars like the world had never before seen, owing to the radical changes in ideas and final throwing off of Christianity. So he died in 1900. He also asserts that the will to power is the fundamental reality. This world is the will to power and nothing else. Critique of Nietzsche. It is hardly necessary to point out that his doctrines are erroneous and how they are so. Indeed, monstrous would be a better word to describe them. But despite these decidedly negative qualities, and despite the fact that he was a madman, Friedrich Nietzsche happens to be one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. He made it to 1900. His influence on Hitler can be clearly seen, and thus the ravings of the madman Nietzsche must be assigned as directly responsible for the monstrous ideas of National Socialism and for the Second World War, which not only inflicted violent death upon 60 million people, that's how many people perished in World War II, 60 million, as a direct result of the war, but also put the world in a political and social upheaval from which it has not yet recovered. It must be furthermore pointed out that his assessment of the decadence of Christian civilization was essentially true. It is true that Europe, as a result of the 18th century impiety and the 19th century revolutions, had put to death its ancient heritage, both religious and cultural. French Revolution, basically, was the catapult of all of that. But the 18th century thinking was what caused the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, and was ready to replace it with the brutal and pagan systems which we read on the pages of Nietzsche, Marx, and Engels, as well as of Jews and Freemasons, all of whom wished to construct a new civilization on the ashes of Christianity. So Christianity is, the Novus Ordo put to death, essentially, Christianity. So all of this has you can see the development of all of this from the 19th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. And here we are, ready for the Great Reset. A new civilization on the ashes of Christianity. That's why this course is important. So, how are we on time? Well, we can start Feuerbach. Left-wing Hegelians. So there's left-wing Hegelians and right-wing Hegelians. So look at the left-wing Hegelians. Feuerbach, 1804 to 1872. He was born in Landshut, Bavaria, and died in Reschenberg, since 1899, a district of Nuremberg. Nietzsche is quoted to have said that Feuerbach means fiery brook. It's true. Feuer is fire. Bach means brook, a little river, a little stream. He matriculated at the University of Heidelberg with the intention of pursuing an ecclesiastical career. Through the influence of Professor Karl Daub, he was led to an interest in the then predominant philosophy of Hegel, and in spite of his father's opposition, went to Berlin to study under the master himself. After 2 years' discipleship, the Hegelian influence began to slacken. Feuerbach became associated with a group known as the Young Hegelians, who synthesized a radical offshoot of Hegelian philosophy. Theology, he wrote to a friend, I can bring myself to study no more. I long to take nature to my heart, that nature before whose depth the faint-hearted theologian shrinks back, and with nature man in his entire quality. So he becomes a humanist. These words are a key to Feuerbach's development. He completed his education at Erlangen at the Friedrich Alexander University, Erlangen, Nuremberg, with the study of natural science. His first book, published anonymously, Gedanken über Tod und Unsterblichkeit, which means Thoughts on Death and Immortality, 1830, contains an attack on personal immortality and an advocacy of the Spinozistic immortality of reabsorption in nature. That's also Karl Rahner. You get reabsorbed into the cosmos when you die. Karl Rahner. Okay. Just so you know. These principles, combined with his embarrassed manner of public speaking, debarred him from academic advancement. After some years of struggling, during which he published his Geschichte der Neueren Philosophie, a history of the newer philosophy, and Abelard und Eloise, in German, he married in 1837 and lived a rural existence at Bruckberg, that means Bridge Mountain, near Nuremberg, supported by his wife's share in a small porcelain factory. In 2 weeks of this period, Pierre Bayle, who was a radical Enlightenment figure in France in the 18th century, and Philosophie und Christentum, philosophy and Christianity, which deal largely with theology, he had proven that Christianity has, in fact, long vanished, not only from the reason, but from the life of mankind, that it is nothing more than a fixed idea in flagrant contradiction to the distinctive features of contemporary civilization. This attack is followed up in his most important work, Das Wesen des Christentums, The Essence of Christianity, and was translated into English by George Eliot, who was a woman, French and Russian. Its aim may be described shortly as an effort to humanize theology. It's modernism. He lays it down that man, so far as he is rational, is to himself his own object of thought. Religion is consciousness of the infinite. That's pure modernism. So Feuerbach is a big figure in the history of modernism. All right.